Friday, April 12th, 1912. RMS Titanic, somewhere at sea. I have now discovered that when one is aboard ship, there is a whole new vocabulary to learn. I got Robert to explain some of it to me this morning, when he arrived with tea, toast, and jam. Port is left, and starboard is right, I think. It is hard to keep all of these new words straight in my mind. The bow is in front of the ship, and the stern is in the rear. When people say amidships, they seem to mean the middle. Aft is someplace behind you. Corridors are alleyways. The kitchen is a galley, and walls are bulkheads. And never, ever, ever would you call the Titanic a boat. She is a ship. Why ships are called she rather than he has not yet been satisfactorily explained to me. Tradition, perhaps. Mrs. Carstairs has found a group of avid bridge players. They spent most of today playing in the lounge. I watched for a while, but found the intricacies of the game quite dreary. With Mrs. Carstairs thusly occupied, I had plenty of time to explore today. Her only firm request was that I be certain to come to her stateroom before meals to help her dress. That sounds foolish, but with all of her corsets and petticoats and elaborate dresses, she seems to need an extra pair of hands. She changes before every single meal, and I have yet to see her wear the same outfit twice. This variety seems to be very important to the women on the ship, although for the life of me, I am not sure why. It seems a great waste of time to worry about fashion. I even grow impatient during the time it takes to comb my hair. Mrs. Carstairs is disturbed that a young man is serving as our cabin steward, and says she is tempted to request a stewardess instead. I quickly promised that she could depend on me to assist in any way she desires, and reminded her of the lovely job Robert had done arranging her flowers. She seemed dubious, but finally nodded reluctantly and waved me away. I went all the way down, G deck, F deck, I lost count, to the swimming pool and squash court this morning, and peeked inside the rooms. I had no urge to engage in either of these activities, but it was entertaining to watch others do so. Later I examined the Turkish baths, the postal office, and the first-class maids and valets' dining salon. I have not run across many of the maids and valets, and rarely even see the young woman who shares my lavatory. Her name is Josephine, and her employer is a crotchety and demanding elderly woman who keeps her so busy that she scarcely has a moment to herself. I am fortunate that Mrs. Carstairs is far more reasonable about such things. We are perhaps not an ideal pair, but even my brief glimpses of Josephine's harried face rushing by make me count my blessings. For amusement, I rode the lifts for a while, and had a nice chat with a boy named Stephen, who operates one of them. He is from Southampton, and overjoyed to have found employment on such a fine ship. It is funny. I am really only comfortable here when I am speaking to members of the crew. I am sure I would also feel at ease if I were traveling in steerage, since I would no longer feel like such a fraud. I know how lucky I am, but still, it would have been nice if I had earned my passage on this ship. Later on, I wandered into the gymnasium, and the very fit Mr. Macaulay, who oversees the room, demonstrated the various machines for me. In the East End, people are too busy working to exercise, but it seems to be different for the leisure class. I did not care for the mechanical horse or camel, far too jouncy and erratic, but I pedaled quite effectively on a stationary bicycle. It is queer to ride and not go anywhere, but there is a clock on the wall with small pointers that move to show you how far you have traveled. I also tried the rowing machine, but did not find myself to be very adept at this. First-class passengers could go anywhere they choose, but the second class, and most especially the third-class passengers, are restricted to certain parts of the ship. There are actually locked gates and other barriers to keep the steerage passengers segregated from everyone else. The only time I have seen anyone from steerage is from the end of the promenade, looking down at the deck by the ship's stern. That particular deck is known. Here I share some more of my new vernacular, courtesy of Robert, as the poop deck. There is almost always a great laughing crowd gathered there, and some man keeps playing the bagpipes. I have also heard a fiddler. It reminds me fondly of Whitechapel. First-class passengers tend to frown down at the steerage passengers, pointing and making comments as though they were the zoological gardens in Regent's Park. This makes me so uncomfortable that I have decided I will stay to the bow end of the ship as much as possible. I have no sense of what the conditions are like down in steerage, and hope it is not too dreadful. William's stories of his transatlantic voyage were horrid and haunting. I have little sense of what is happening anywhere other than the first-class areas. Part of me would like to go down and see steerage for myself, but the idea of being able to pass through the locked gates at will, while others cannot, is terribly offensive to me. I think it would be very contemptuous. In the lift, Stephen told me that a number of the first-class passengers have done just that, laughing when they returned and talking about how much fun it was to go slumming. So despite my curiosity, I have no intention of doing that myself. The ship is so big that you can actually get tired walking around it. When I bring Florence, I always have to carry her part of the way. She can be fierce, but she is not very hardy. Because it is so cold, Mrs. Carstairs has been making me put a tiny handmade sweater on Florence before taking her out. This seems whimsical to me, but I am not about to argue. Besides, Florence enjoys preening. On more than one occasion, I have passed a remarkably tall, mustached man walking his Airedale on the boat deck. He has been pointed out to me as Colonel Astor, and Mrs. Carstairs says that he is one of the richest men in the entire world. He never seems to look cheerful, except when he is walking his dog. People are always gossiping about his wife, because she is much younger than he is, and in the family way. There is so much gossip during meals, about everyone and everything, that I am very glad to be such an anonymous figure. Once people find out that I am only a companion, most of them promptly lose interest in me, and begin to talk to someone else. I am not easily offended, so this bothers me not a twit. Besides, the marvelous meals themselves continue to offer me plenty of distraction. A man named Mr. Collins has attached himself to us because we are unescorted. Apparently, gentlemen aboard ship feel a duty to look after women traveling alone. Mrs. Carstairs says her Frederick would be very pleased to know that we are so well protected. His guardianship seems mostly demonstrated by his taking Mrs. Carstairs by one elbow and leading us to our table at mealtimes. If Mrs. Carstairs is out on deck, a fairly rare event, as she continues to be occupied by marathon card games. Mr. Hollings makes certain that the ever-responsive stewards are paying her what he feels is sufficient attention. Often now, during meals, he joins us, along with a rather weedy young man named Ralph Kittery, whose sole pursuits appear to be polo and the American stock market. Mrs. Carstairs is much better about feigning interest in these subjects than I am. I can manage nothing better than a vague, impersonal smile, and maybe a nod or two. What an unusual situation, to be seated at tables full of Americans, meal after meal. They are lively people, but almost childishly gullible. Any English man or woman would instantly see through my accent, which is, at best, of the light Oxford variety. I have been introduced to some of the British passengers, in the reception room, before dinner, and so forth, and once I speak, they almost always give me a smile that looks more like a wry wink. But the Americans all seem to think that I sound terribly clever. When I do speak, Mrs. Carstairs appears to hold her breath. I am not exactly sure what she fears I will say, but it seems as good a reason as any to remain reserved. A Mrs. Jansen from Philadelphia was included in our dinner group this evening. She is blonde and willowy and prone to blinking constantly. She asked where I was from, and when I said Whitechapel, by way of Wapping, she commented upon the beauty of the names. Insofar as Whitechapel is concerned, I wanted to say that yes, Jack the Ripper had apparently shared her affection for this area, but I held my tongue. Rarely do these Americans seem to enjoy my humor, but sometimes, I admit, I cannot resist. I met the most remarkable Parisian child on the boat deck today, I remarked, during a lull in the conversation tonight. Scarcely 4 years old, and already speaking French. A puzzled silence fell over the table. Then, to my surprise, Horace, the wine steward, laughed. He was not joined by anyone else, quickly changed the laugh into a cough, and began to refill everyone's glasses. In the meantime, I returned to my haddock, and soon the conversation shifted once again to the many joys of the summer season in Newport. Such are the social interactions I have been experiencing. I must be a terrible disappointment as a companion, since Mrs. Carstairs and I are able to find little common conversational ground. But I am continuing to assume a number of mundane housekeeping chores for her, so I guess I am fulfilling the requirements of a maid. These tasks include sending her clothes out daily to be sponged and pressed, changing the water in her flower vases, ordering trays for her, and of course taking very good care of Florence. Devoted as Mrs. Carstairs is to her dog, she does not seem to enjoy walking her, or, more crucially, cleaning up after her. Yesterday, Florence caught me off guard right at the end of a row of covered lifeboats, and a passing ship's officer gallantly contributed his handkerchief to the cause. I was happy to retire somewhat earlier than usual tonight. My day of exploring fatigued me. The sound of those steadily throbbing engines below is very soothing, and also helps lull one to sleep. With all the many sights on the ship, I think that I like the reading and writing room best of all. I could easily spend the full day there, and never grow restless. Between that room and the library, I would have no trouble finding activities to amuse myself. The weather was so lovely today. I hope tomorrow is just as nice. Saturday, April 13th, 1912, RMS Titanic. I really enjoy the morning ritual of having tea and scones in my room, and as much conversation as we can manage before the peal of a bell calls Robert away. He has taken to bringing an extra scone or two, and joining me in my meal. "How is it down in steerage?" I asked him today. "Oh, quite comfortable," he assured me. "I would be right pleased to journey that way myself. I've seen ships where second class is not so nice as our third." I gave that some thought. "How are your cabins, then?" "Well, we have very little time to spend there," he said after a pause. "And it was a great piece of luck, my catching on with this crew. Many's the week I could find no work, and my mum sore needs the money." "My brother made his passage as a cabin boy on a fair rotter of a steamer," I said. "I never thought I would be anywhere but steerage." He winked at me. "So we've both had a bit of luck, then." As always, bells began to chime, and he was off. Each morning he includes a Titanic small newspaper on my tray, the Atlantic Daily Bulletin, and I picked it up to read. The stories are more chatty than informational, and report items such as the number of miles we have cruised during any given 24-hour period. As the weather has been no handicap, the ship seems to do better and better, and there is a daily contest for passengers to predict the actual figure. We are expected to arrive in New York on Wednesday morning. Oh, I hope William is standing there on the deck waiting for me. Later. This afternoon, while I was on the starboard side promenade, Colonel Astor stopped to pat and admire Florence. He had his own dog in tow, and I asked him what the dog's name was. When he said Kitty, I laughed, which clearly pleased him. He may be an imposing figure, but how could you dislike a man who named his dog Kitty? Mrs. Carstairs and I took tea in the Café Parisien instead of the lounge. The atmosphere is much less formal than the dining salon, and we had a harmonious time. There is a light, airy feel to the room, complemented by numerous plants and wicker chairs. Trains of ivy actually climb the walls. We were joined by several other ladies, one of whom had a great booming laugh, which she employed regularly. Her name is Mrs. Brown, and people seem to think her amusing but boorish. Since she sat down right next to me and plied me with friendly questions, I liked her at once. If anything, discovering that I was a mere companion only increased her attention. She feels that I will find America smashing, and that Boston will suit me well, as the area is famous for its educational institutions. I was encouraged by this information, and hope that her predictions are accurate. For some reason, Mrs. Carstairs is tired of bridge today, so I played hearts with her, still the only game I know, until it was time to help her dress for dinner. She instructed me to wear my Paisley dress, and to save the green silk for tomorrow. I did as I was told, and she surveyed me critically before asking me to take off what she described as that dreadful locket. This stung me, but I only said mildly that it had belonged to my beloved mother, and there were no circumstances under which I would ever take it off. None whatsoever. "All right, then," she said, studying my neckline, and finally sighed. "I will lend you a scarf." It was not until we were waiting for a lift that she remembered to apologize for offending my mother's memory. I accepted this graciously, but touched the locket protectively. All it contains are tiny dark locks of hair from when William and I were babies. I should rather have photographs of my parents, but I treasure it regardless. We were heading for the a la carte restaurant, which everyone calls the Ritz, after a famous hotel. I may not appreciate the connection, but I am sure there is one. The Ritz is smaller and more elegant than the dining salon. The chairs are upholstered in a floral pattern, and the groupings are less linear. The walls are paneled with an almost golden shade of wood, and there are many inset mirrors. Mr. Hollings, who is dining with us again, says that the mirrors give the room the illusion of space. I took him at his word. Our napkins had been folded into upright cones, and the gold-rimmed china is an entirely different pattern from the dishes I have seen elsewhere on the ship. I feel sorry for the people who have to wash all of them. I have studied French, but not sufficiently enough to translate the menu with confidence. It is possible to order a full 9 courses, but even my appetite is not quite equal to that task. I tried caviar for the first time, and did not expect to repeat the experience. Very salty, very strongly flavored, and the eggs had a slippery feel I found unappetizing. I seemed to be the only one at the table to have this reaction, as the caviar disappeared twice as fast as the plover's eggs and other appetizers. With each course we are served a different wine. I sipped some of the glasses, but have yet to come close to finishing one. When the waiter offered to bring me some lemonade, I accepted eagerly. After the meal I was glad to have the excuse of needing to walk Florence, as I felt quite overstuffed. How do ladies like Mrs. Carstairs manage to eat at all while laced into those corsets? I count myself lucky that I have never been forced to put on such a restrictive garment. I suppose it will be inevitable when I am a little older, but I hope to put that particular symbol of maturity off as long as possible. Florence and I each wore our sweaters, as it was cold on the boat deck. I sat in a deck chair for a few moments, breathing the refreshing air and looking up at the stars. In every other direction, I could only see the blackness of the ocean. Mostly, I could not even see that, but I sensed it. The ship's light seemed warm and comforting in the midst of this lonely ocean. A first-class gentleman, I do not remember his name, walked past me and began to light a cigarette. "Excuse me, miss," he began, and then paused to look at me more closely. "Aren't you Evelyn Carstairs' maid? I am not sure you are permitted out on this deck." I instantly felt ashamed, but also angry. "I am chaperoning the dog," I answered. He shrugged, lit a cigarette right in front of me, and continued on his way. Gentlemen never smoke in front of ladies, but I guess servants do not count. My peaceful time ruined, I got up and returned inside. I must try to remember that, for the most part, people on the ship have been very nice to me indeed. And he had smelled of whiskey, so perhaps he was not in his right mind. Even so, it hurt my feelings.